Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to the Altitude Show. I'm your host, Dave Brinker. Today, we have Shane Mahoney on the show. Shane is internationally recognized as a conservationist and a wildlife advocate. He's considered the foremost expert on the North American model of wildlife and conservation. Mahoney has 30 years experience working primarily as a scientist, wildlife manager, policy innovator, strategic advisor, filmmaker, writer, narrator, TV and radio personality, and not to mention a great lecturer. Shane is a strong believer in the benefits of communicating conservation, science, and hunting to the public. He's the founder of the Wild Harvest Initiative and Conservation Visions. He's a prominent speaker in the conservation community. I've heard him many, many times, have become friends over the years. My conversations with him, oh my gosh, they bend my brain in ways that no one else can. I feel like I need to take a nap afterwards because he's so smart. So grab a cup of coffee, buckle up. It's a really good one. Don't forget to support our sponsors, GoHunt.com. If you haven't tried their new mapping app and tool, you need to. I've been using it all season. It's amazing. One feature I'll point out today is rather than having to, if you want to save a map for offline use, you don't have to save a million squares like some of the other apps. You can save really big areas with one click. You should go check it out. GoHunt.com, their maps and all the other stuff, their gear shop, all their research tools. PeaksEquipment.com, trekking poles, gaiters, headlamps, a bunch of other stuff coming out and down the pipe. Really, really cool company. You need to go out and support them. Use my code ALTITUDE to get a discount on their products. It's PeaksEquipment.com. Outdoor class, whether you're a new hunter or an experienced hunter, we can all learn and get better. Outdoor class is a platform where you can learn from the best of the best of the best. Again, use my code ALTITUDE to get a discount to sign up. It's a really, really, really cool tool. And people like Remy Warren, Corey Jacobson, Randy Newberg, I mean, who better to learn from? Go check those things out. Enjoy my conversation with Shane Mahoney. Here we go. The Altitude Show is brought to you by Peaks Equipment, the world's leading technical, hard goods, and accessories brand for backcountry enthusiasts. From trekking poles to headlamps to best-in-class gaiters, Peaks delivers a system of products that work to achieve optimal performance in the harshest conditions. Don't suffer on your hunting adventures. Peaks enables you to thrive on the mountain when everyone else is going home. Visit peaksequipment.com and use code ALTITUDE for 10% off today. That's ALTITUDE for 10% off on peaksequipment.com. Outdoor Class is the new source of premium outdoor education from trusted and knowledgeable experts. For hunters committed to improving their skills, Outdoor Class is the only subscription-based e-learning platform that provides unlimited access to video lessons from the world's most respected experts. Learn from industry leaders like Corey Jacobson, Randy Newberg, Remy Warren, and other experts across all the topics that affect you as a hunter. Make sure to follow Outdoor Class Official on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and take your game to the next level by going to outdoorclass.com. You can use code ALTITUDE at checkout for 20% off. That is ALTITUDE at checkout for 20% off at Outdoor Class. Shane Mahoney, welcome to the Altitude Show, bud.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's to rejoin after a few years.
It's a pleasure to see. I think I saw you at the sheep show this year, maybe in passing, but I could have my years mixed up.
No, I was there this year, so it's possible. Those things are usually a bit of a whirlwind. So
yeah, did you speak there this year?
Yes, I was on a panel discussion, sort of in a separate room, and also I spoke in giving a tribute to Dr. Valerius Geist, who passed away in July of last year, and so I think it was on Thursday night or maybe Friday night. I can't recall now. I gave a short talk about his work, the importance, obviously, of it to the wild sheep in general and to the Wild Sheep Foundation itself.
Now you've kind of made a life. Obviously, you have a very diverse background, of which we'll get into. But most recently, you spent a lot of time on the road speaking. Yes. Obviously, you have your projects that you work on probably more full time, but where I see you the most is speaking, and you're always one of my favorite speakers because, it's really hard to be well spoken in front of people. Most humans don't have that capacity. And then not only that, but speak with passion and authority. and actually get across points that are impactful. You know, a lot of times you'll sit through those speeches at these dinners, and it's just for me, I don't have a high attention span, so it's hard for me to follow a lot of the speakers, especially when people are talking over them and stuff. But usually when you speak, people are listening. So I always appreciate you hearing your points. But before we get to all that, I wanted to dive a little bit further into the past. I want to hear more about where you came from. I'm fascinated by your home country, and I want to learn a little bit about more of your family and kind of what created the Shane Mahoney of the now. So tell me a little bit about where you grew up.
Well, I think it's a very good question, actually. It can be asked of any human being, obviously, because we are all products of the places where we were born and raised and the circumstances that prevailed. And the good and the bad thing about life, I guess, is that none of us, as we come into this world as a newborn human, really have any say over where we end up, do we? I mean, we're born to parents, we live in a place, we experience a culture, and that's not of our choosing necessarily. And so the shaping that takes place on us and through us and with us is really kind of an unavoidable reality in a lot of ways. I think I was very fortunate, first of all, to grow up where I did. I was born, raised, and I continue to live and will always live on the island of Newfoundland, which is the easternmost part of Canada, and in fact is the easternmost part of North America. The next closest land eastward, of course, is Europe. The island was very much an isolated circumstance. It was an independent country until 1949, which not very many people recognize. And it joined Canada in 1949 after the Second World War, when both the United States and Britain, and particularly Britain, was concerned about what our status might be in terms of independence because of our importance as a launching pad for war activities during the Second World War, when the Americans and Canadians were involved in the European conflicts. The island is a very large island. It's 43,000 square miles. It's one of the largest islands in the world.
Whoa, I didn't know that.
Yeah, and so, people often think, well, if we come to the island, Shane, we're landing in such and such a place, hopefully we'll see you. But, it's 500 miles straight across this island, if you were to drive it. And it's extraordinarily diverse. Landscape-wise, the eastern portion of the island was actually torn from the North African continent. The western side of the island, which actually includes the furthest northward extension of the Appalachians, which dive under the ocean and rise again here, obviously came from the North American plate. And the central part of the island is really an ancient seabed that was thrust upward with the collision of plates in the past tectonic history. The position of the island, where it is very close to the Grand Banks, the famous fishing grounds that attracted European and global fishing enterprises for at least 500 years, although the Basques were here even before that. And of course, we were the site where the Norse, the only confirmed Norse settlement in North America, actually.
The Basques were there first?
Yes, the Basques were fishing off the coast of Newfoundland. We know, long before the so-called discovery of the island in 1497. The history says that Jean Caboto, actually discovered the island in 1497. But we know that the Basques were fishing here sort of clandestinely because they didn't want anyone to know where they were finding these massive sources of codfish, which was extremely important, particularly in Catholic Europe, because fish, of course, was a mainstay of the diet, and every Friday it had to be fish, and so on and so forth. So the Basques were always being tracked by the English and the Portuguese and the Spanish and others. Well, not so much the Spanish, but the Portuguese and the English. But the Basque fleets would lose them in the fogs as they got closer and closer to this part of the Atlantic, and then would leave them behind. So we actually know that the Basques were here, yes, quite early in the years previous to 1497. And of course, they had a massive presence here as a whaling activity. Whales teemed in these waters in the 1500s and so on. And the first permanent settlements in Newfoundland actually was in 1610. By permanent, I mean permanent European settlement. So very similar to Jamestown. The only thing was that there was an already established fishery back and forth between Europe and here previous to that. So that gives me some legitimacy when I say we're the oldest non-native culture in North America. We were doing business here, real business, on the island of Newfoundland long before that was happening anywhere else. But of course, when we came here as Europeans, we settled a land that was already settled by indigenous peoples, as was true across virtually the full extent of the continent. But the Vikings, the Norse, there was much debate as to whether they ever made it to such a place called Vinland, which was made famous in the Norse sagas. But the discovery of the community of Lanso Meadows, as it's known, is a fully confirmed, authentic Norse settlement on the northern peninsula of the island of Newfoundland, and in fact is not very far from where I grew up as a boy. And that has now been established as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The old buildings have been reconstructed, the old forges have been reconstructed, and so on. And it's quite an extraordinary thing to see. And so we had, if you will, when humans came out of Africa 70,000 years ago and began to move, up and then throughout Europe and then throughout Asia and all the way around to come into North America across the land bridge between Alaska and Siberia, Thuringia, the first time that those who went across Europe were to meet those humans who went around the world to come into North America. The first time they met again was in the year 1000, when the Norse landed on the coast of Newfoundland and met, of course, the indigenous peoples who were the founding nations here, and of course were the peoples who had come through Asia and all the way around into the
And that's
world.
now been confirmed?
Oh, that's confirmed. That's confirmed. It's a national park site. It's a World Heritage Site, as I said, and you can visit it any time, and people are there in costume and the forge is working and all of that kind of thing. Absolutely extraordinary find. And we're pretty certain now we've just discovered a second one further south. But the island itself is a magnificent place physically. It has what can only be described as daunting beauty. It is an extraordinarily rugged place, big seas, big rocks, big expanses of open barren lands on the southern part of the island, massive fjords that run just like the folds of an accordion on the south coast of the island, which very few people really ever get to see because it's quite isolated. And, when I grew up as a boy here, most of the communities, or many of the communities, were not connected by road. The only connection was really by boat. And so people made their way. Marriages and families were built, and houses were moved, and families reunited. And all of these kinds of normal things that you associate with flying or driving today, that was, of course, all done by small open boat. And we had a culture here that developed out of that, which made us extraordinary seamen. Winston Churchill said that beyond question that Newfoundlanders were the best small boatmen in the world. And that said something for Winston Churchill, talking about the British Navy, to be able to say someone else was the best. But it was true. We developed an extraordinary capacity at sea. We were a killing culture in the sense that we lived extraordinarily close to nature. We hunted fish, both as a means of food survival and as a means of truck, in other words, as a means of our economies. We lived in very isolated communities where everyone knew everyone, where everyone helped everyone. There were no police where I grew up. There were no banks. There were no lawyers. There were none of those institutions whatsoever.
Oh, wow.
And so we had no idea about any of that foolishness. If somebody got out of hand, well, somebody took care of that. Children were communal. It was not uncommon at all, for women women were pregnant every cycle. It was the way we lived. Families were very large, 12, 15, 17, 18.
Whoa.
The largest brood of children I knew was 22, the Duceys in Marystown, where I lived.
But they all helped each other.
They all helped each other, even to the point where, women would who were still nursing, for example, would think nothing of taking another child up to their breast and feeding that child if it was hungry, just as they would their own. So it evolved into a very different culture, which preserved a huge component of ancient English expressions. And in fact, in parts of the island, because of the strong Irish influence, there were still regions in 1900, 1910 that were predominantly Gaelic, and that was the language. Wildlife abounds here, obviously, the whales and fishes. I mean, the legends of Newfoundland in that regard are extraordinary. Ships' captains, sending mail back to Europe through the 15th, 16th, and 17th century said that it was incredibly unsafe waters simply because of the numbers of massive whales that schooled here that they would run into constantly.
Oh, wow.
The famous fishing with baskets over the sides of the boats, flotillas of lobsters that just covered the bottom of the shallow coves and so on and so forth. And then inland, of course, we had the famous woodland caribou of Newfoundland and a variety of other species. It was and very much remains a place settled along the coast, because that's where the fish were, and you had to establish as close to the fishing grounds as possible. The limits of human endurance, we proved over 5 centuries, was for a single man, to take approximately an 18 to 20 foot wooden boat and to row that 3 miles to sea at 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock in the morning, to handline fish all day, to load up his boat, and to be able to row back in the evening with that boat full of fish, and then clean the fish and split the fish and salt the fish and so on, fall asleep in your clothes and get up the next day to do the same thing. So it bred a great sense of independence, a great reliance on cultural expression. We're famous for our music, famous for the dancing.
What type of music?
Here. It's a very much a Celtic influence, of course, the Irish, the English, and the Scottish, with some influence by the French. It's a very famous place for that. There's music everywhere here. Even today, you go downtown in St. John's, you'll always have music every evening at the pubs of first-class performers.
What's the biggest city up there?
St. John's.
St. John's.
Which is about 110,000 people.
Oh, okay.
Out of a total population of the whole island and the mainland part of the province of about 500 and maybe 10,000.
Okay, so I mean, most of the population is there, and then you spread them out across 45,000 square miles, pretty much.
Yes. Well, that's just the island. You have to remember that there's a mainland part of the province of Newfoundland and Labrador as a part of Canada. And there's 110,000 square miles of big land, as we call it, to the north. And in all of that, there's only about 30,000 people.
Oh my gosh. Wow. I have to get up there sometime. I almost got an opportunity to come hunt woodland caribou, but it didn't work out. But man, I would just love to see that country.
It's amazing. Believe me. And I've seen a lot of it, and I've seen a lot of the world too. And there are a lot of beautiful places. But Newfoundland has this kind of hold on its people in the same way that Ireland does the Irish. It's, you never meet a Newfoundlander anywhere, no matter how successful they have been, who isn't longing to come home. It's a very visceral thing,
like loyal.
Yeah, and it comes from the physical space itself. It's not just about the people. When they say come home, they don't normally mean in the same way other people do, in the sense that, yes, they're coming home to see family and friends and things of this nature, but what they actually miss is the sheer physicality of Newfoundland. It is a living space in a way that's hard to describe, but once you experience it, it is just something you sort of constantly long for.
It's amazing. It's amazing the confidence that you exude when you say, I live here now and I will always live here. There's no ever any place I would rather live. Not a lot of people can say that. A lot of people spend the first part of their life trying to get away from home, and then the second part of their life trying to get back home, type thing. I know that was me.
Yeah.
But and I've encountered this with you in the other times we've hung out, is just that loyalty to your home and that culture. The only other place I've seen that is with my wife's Mexican family. They're the same way.
Could be.
They're
That
like,
could be, yeah.
you know, they have a high degree of loyalty. You know, Americans are like, where I came from, it sucks. You know, I want to get out of there. You know, there's a lot of times that's kind of how we act. But I love to hear that.
Well, one of the interesting things about language here, we have it's called the Dictionary of Newfoundland English. It's a scholarly work put together by linguists who, found this treasure trove of Old English still in use in Newfoundland and still is to this day. But up until 25, 30 years ago, it's very common speak here to say things that most people in the English world cannot understand. And but one of the expressions that we have here, which is totally unique to Newfoundland in the English-speaking world, whenever any of us meet someone for the first time, usually one of the very first questions that's asked is, where do you belong? It's not where were you born? It's not where do you come from? It's not, it's not like that. The question that's asked, where do you belong? And it's the only place I know for a fact in the English-speaking world where that expression is used. And so that refers not just to, are you a Newfoundlander, for example? That's also asking you, where on this island do you belong?
Oh.
Where were you born? You know, where is your family from? Where is your great, great, great grandfather buried? Because of course, these communities were long established, isolated entities, where the graveyards are the history of long, long lineages.
Were they pretty tribal at that time?
There's always been an element of two things, which is something that you find with deeply localized and almost an indigenous, and I would call Newfoundland culture almost quasi-indigenous in a sense. You usually find a bifacial reality there. One is that local communities can be very tribal, and this is true in Borneo, it's true in Newfoundland. So yes, the answer to that question, they could be tribal. You know, there's always a little bit of, except at times of disaster when everyone helped, there could always be a little bit of competitiveness over the grounds or where the fish were or these kinds of things.
Yep.
But the flip side of that was there was also, because of this tribalism, there was also this kind of, sense of defense of one another in a community. And there really were, very few limits to which people would go to help one another. I mean, and if you're familiar with the famous play that was on Broadway and many other major production houses around the world, Come From Away, which describes the hospitality of Newfoundlanders to the people who were caught up in the terrible 9/11 fiasco. When we had communities that had, 5 times as many people to be looked after than there were actually people in the communities themselves, and they did it. This is very much a trait of this isolation. And also it's very much a trait, frankly, of people who remain directly dependent on nature. Cultures that remain directly dependent on nature are never far away from the fateful reality of how quickly life can change in serious ways. Injury, death, starvation, these kinds of things. Yeah. Major storms that destroy everything you have, and there's no government to help you. There's no relief fund, there's no one coming to your rescue. When you have that, a lot of things spring out of that. Deep religiosity, often very firm belief in the idea of God and future life, always turning out to help one another, and also a capacity to do things that most people would think should just be dismissed out of hand. And I could give you an example. One of the very common things as a boy to see was to look out on the Northwest Atlantic, major bays and coves and so on, and see houses out in the middle of that water being towed by, small boats with either very small engines or even people rowing them. Someone might say, I live in this community, but, I moved here because I married someone from this community. We met wherever at some sort of fishing camp or whatever it might be. But now I want to move back to where my mother and father live. Well, the solution to that problem in our case was not to say, well, okay, you should move back there. We'll bring you by boat and then we'll build you a new house. No, it was considered to be just normal. Well, okay, you want to move there? We'll take your house. We'll bring it down to the beach. We'll launch it out into the water. We'll move everything upstairs and we'll float you 10, 15, 20, 30 miles across the Northwest Atlantic to wherever you want to be. And then we'll drag that up with horses and our backs ourselves. And we'll put that house next to your mother's if that's where you want to live. We did that all the time. This was just normal stuff.
Wow. That's insane. What an interesting culture that at least I don't have a lot of exposure to. We didn't learn about that in school.
No, it's a unique place, and it's.
So you were obviously living very close to nature growing up as a kid. Talk a little bit about that, because it probably shaped you a lot for ultimately going into zoology and, becoming the man that you are.
There's no question about that. Sometimes people look for kinds of mysterious workings in their lives. I don't have to look at all for anything mysterious. It's a simple matter that I grew up with animals. My first memories are of animals. My deepest memories and fondest memories are of animals, not of humans. Those animals were wild animals. They were also, in some cases, our domestic animals, the few horses we would keep or the sheep we would raise. My earliest memories as a small boy, are about just before and around 3 years of age. And, they have to do with being out on the sea ice. They have to do with, catching things like small birds and images in people's houses. I mean, there's some of them that stay so clear with me, even though they were just normal images for a boy like me. But I remember we lived in a place called St. Anthony, which was just north of where the Viking settlement is now, the same region of the island. There was no roads there, except within the community, there was a little bit of roadway, but nothing to connect it. And so the travel was either by coastal boat or by dog sled. That was the only means of travel that we had. And I remember, a few snippets of memory of about that age of being out in, this is a very cold place in winter. But of course, you were out in it all the time, and no one stayed indoors. We didn't have television, and we didn't have anything else. So you
didn't have Instagram?
No, you didn't have Snapchat or any of that kind of stuff, unless that's what you call talking to somebody over a fence. That's Snapchat, I guess. But I remember this one image from that time in particular of standing near someone's kitchen. Now, we had no central heating, so the only warm room in any house was the kitchen, where we had a wood stove. That's all. You'd wake up in the morning and you could scrape the ice off your window. This is not an exaggeration. It's just how we lived, and that was normal. Take a hot rock to the bed with you in the nighttime and that kind of stuff, whether you were 6 months old or 60 years old.
Wow. But
I remember this image, and the kitchens would be blistering hot. They were so hot. They were unbelievably hot. And there was this group of women sitting around a table, an old chrome kind of table, kitchen table. And there was 4 or 5 of them, and these were matronly women, and these were hardworking women who worked, chopping wood and splitting fish and tending gardens and raising massive families. And so, they didn't look like the Kardashians, and they didn't want to. These were the kind of women who make societies work. And we used to have a very small bird called the dovekie. We call them bullbirds, little, about 4 or 5 inches long, would come down from Greenland in massive numbers. And of course, we were isolated, so fresh meat meant a great deal to us. And these wild birds were incredibly important. And we would harvest them in the thousands. And I remember looking into this kitchen, and there were these big, robust women were sitting around the table, chatting and talking and plucking these little birds. And there was a mound of feathers, higher than I was on their kitchen floor. And there was a mound of little carcasses equally as high on the other side. And I thought nothing of it, of course, because it was normal at the time. But now I look back on that and I think about, that's no more. That doesn't happen like that anymore. And for a lot of people in the world today, their sensibilities might even have been offended, by seeing the roughness of this and how the food was treated, and doing that in your kitchen, for example, not in an abattoir or whatever.
Right.
But this is what I mean about being surrounded by nature. You didn't have to wonder as a little boy where food came from. It came from the natural world. And you didn't have to worry about having respect and caring for animals, because if you didn't have respect and care for animals, they didn't grow up. They didn't grow up and live for you to breed them and to have lambs next spring or these kinds of things. And so that, and the wild animals that lived on the land, the caribou and the bears and the fox, of course.
Did you guys have moose there?
We do. We have a lot of moose, and they were introduced though in 1904, and we did have moose had made their way up to the northern peninsula in the 1950s and 60s, but they were still relatively few up there. But,
why weren't moose naturally there? How did that happen?
Well, the island is separated from the mainland of Canada by only 11 miles, which is not something that would normally prevent a moose, for example, from colonizing. But the currents that run through that channel of 11 miles are incredibly strong.
Oh.
So the island of Newfoundland is very interesting biologically, because we only have 14 species of endemic mammals, of native mammals that are native to the island. But we have just 11 miles away on the mainland of Canada about 34 or 35 species. So it was a very select group of species that made it.
So some of them made it across and some of them didn't, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. It's island biogeography. It's what happens.
But the grizzly bears did. Now you guys don't have, no?
No, we have black bears. They made it. But we did have grizzly bears in the mainland part of the province, north of the island.
Okay.
That was much debated whether grizzly bears actually made it east of Hudson's Bay. But we now know from grizzly bear skulls that we found in the middens of indigenous peoples there, that there's no question that the grizzly did make it as far east as the Atlantic Ocean.
So black bear, woodland caribou. What other big game species?
Well, there were no other big game species.
Oh,
we did have wolves, otters, species of that scale and size, bats, of course, and some rodents. But the only really two large mammal species that would normally be called big game for hunting as such would be woodland caribou and bears, both of which reached magnificent sizes, which is part of the island effect. They're very big animals.
Now, I don't want to jump ahead too much, but woodland caribou, tell me a little bit about their current state, because I was talking to somebody the other day and he told me that they're very near banning all hunting of woodland caribou because of the populations.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Not only woodland caribou, but all caribou populations and ecotypes across North America, have suffered. There are a few exceptions, but not many. Really, right across the entire continent, the populations of caribou have fallen a great deal. I mean, in some cases by 90%, 95%, whatever. Wow. And there's a huge amount of effort to try to figure out what's happening there. For woodland caribou, that form of animal, and we have woodland caribou on the island of Newfoundland. Newfoundland is really the only place left in North America where you can actually hunt these animals. And there's some talk that may now be taken away as well. It is important to point out, though, David, that our world has developed a society that is very focused on the here and now. What happened in the last year or the last 10 years may be of some relevance. But what happened 50 years ago or 75 years ago or 100 years ago has almost become something that it seems to me most people don't really think about it. That affects scientists and bankers and politicians, and religious and, in other words, everyone in society. But if you go back to the period of the 1850s to the 1920s, we saw similar massive declines in caribou populations across this continent. Most researchers are not aware of that. Most graduate students have absolutely no idea about it. And so, yes, we have seen massive declines again, but I put them in the context of recurring phenomena, not as an isolated incident.
What was the determination on that on the last time this happened?
There's no question. We studied this, and I was involved heavily in studying this question of what drove these declines here in Newfoundland. We threw a massive amount of money, and a great many researchers from Canada and the United States formed a major team to look at this. There's no question that what drives these big cycles is that ultimately those populations fall from what we call density dependence. Their own numbers become too high. They overshoot the capacity of their ranges. They deplete their ranges. Many of the foods that they rely on are very slow to recover. The populations decline, calf survival declines, calf birth weight declines, and thus survival declines. The old animals eventually die off. And so you have this cascading effect of no recruitment, death of the elderly, so to speak, and the populations tumble down, tumble down, tumble down.
Until their habitat recovers and the cycle
and they come back.
Gotcha.
And then as they are on the way down, of course, the predators also take a heavy toll because these are weakened cohorts. The predators have built their numbers up, of course, tracking the bigger populations. And then, so when the populations start to fall, the predators' relative impact on them is much greater, which very often leads people to conclude that it's the predators that have driven the system.
Right.
But that, again, is because they are taking the short-term view. In that phase of the population, predators are having a major impact. There's no question. But the predators were always there, including when the populations were rapidly increasing. So the effect predators have on these populations is very much what we would say phase dependent.
Right. What are the two sides of that debate? I'm assuming there's probably a couple major sides of this debate. One being that this is a natural cycle that has many variables and you can't just pin it on one thing. Is it like the United States when things like this occur? And I'm just totally generalizing and oversimplifying, right? But there's this side that'll say, this is because of climate change and hunting, for example, or whatever. And then the other side says, no, this is because of A, B, C, X, Y, Z. Is it similar up there how the debate is working?
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's no real difference between people that way. If we look at here, we look at the United States, we look at Europe, the debates over, for example, the role of predators is the issues are somewhat different, but largely the sort of personalities of the debates are the same. Some people think that predators are just, I guess on their own lethal mission, they're going to eat up every bit of prey out there. So I guess what's going to leave them is just their own death and destruction, which doesn't happen. And others who think that, these predators really don't have much of an impact at all. As I said, until you have a broad understanding of what the dynamic of the population of prey is, whether it is elk or whether it is caribou or mule deer or pronghorn or whatever it might be, unless you have a broad understanding of all the factors that are taking place and have longitudinal data, long-term data, it's very difficult to take any particular factor and say, what is its proportional impact on that system? And the truth of the matter is, we relatively rarely have that kind of complete picture in our data.
Right.
It takes a lot of money. It takes a lot of political support. It takes a lot of the right people in the right places.
It takes time, obviously.
And it takes time.
People don't like waiting for stuff in these debates.
No, they don't. And then they don't want to look back. I mean,
right.
One time as a graduate student, and this is the change in culture. I mean, one time as a graduate student, you quoted very old historic literature. That's where you began your literature cited, your quotations. I read master's and PhD theses today, and it's extraordinary. And the same way with published papers. It's extraordinary how few years they go back to search the literature. It's a decade, maybe 2 decades. It's not a century or a half a century and so on and so forth. And many of the founding studies were done that long ago, and they were as correct today as they were then. But it's this short-term view, this rapid accessibility, the capacity to search digitally for the last thing that someone else said that has gotten us into this situation where science itself is being transformed by this, and not in a positive way.
No, and it happens with all issues.
It happens with all issues. And so, and it's not to blame the graduate students, if there's anyone in quotation marks to blame. I would put more blame on the mature researchers than I would on the new students who are coming into the game. But the truth of the matter is, everybody is being molded by the hands of cultural change. And the trick is, if you want to have any chance of escaping that and not being a cookie cutter person, as I call it, the only way to escape that is to realize that that is happening and to step out of it and question. Very few people do that, as we know.
Right. But with woodland caribou specifically, I mean, what are the populations right now? What does that look like? Are they at 90% decline, 80%, 70%?
Well, I'll give you two examples to give you an idea of sort of how, some sort of a range. There was a massive caribou population known as the George River herd. It was very famous. It was in Labrador and Quebec. It moved between the two provinces. That population peaked at about 750,000 animals. I witnessed their migrations, their movements. It was really something to see. I mean, as the old stories of the bison and so on remarked to us, the land itself was simply moving. They were like maggots on a carcass, these caribou on the land. That's what they looked like. Shimmering in the distance, just wherever you looked, you could see this movement taking place of hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands. It was just absolutely amazing. That population today is down to about 10 to 12,000 animals, 750,000 down to 10 to 12. So
wow.
Over the massive range they occupy, you might as well say they appear to have disappeared. On the island of Newfoundland, we had at our peak about 110,000 animals. Still a lot of animals for this island. I mean, when I worked with them, and I worked with them for 30 years, every day I walked, every single day I walked, when they were at their peak, I walked with caribou. They were on the hills, they were in the valleys, they were crossing the streams ahead of me. I mean, they were companions. They were just there all the time, not like moose or bears. These were always there. And now that population of 110,000 animals is down below 30,000 and still falling. So, where that will go, David, we're not sure, but they will go lower and they will take a long time to come back. In 1905, coming back to this idea of phases and long-term data, in 1905, so 117 years ago, the adjacent province or state, we call them provinces in Canada, of Nova Scotia, had lost its caribou entirely. And it approached the Newfoundland government and asked for 5 animals. And the Newfoundland government wrote them back. This is all recorded. We have the letters, wrote them back and said, regrettably, though we would like to help you, Newfoundland simply cannot afford to send you 5 of our caribou at this time because our populations are so depleted. 1905.
Yeah, talk about having context.
Yes. So I would say that the vast majority of people working on caribou today, whether here or elsewhere, have no idea that actually happened.
Wow.
That's the world we live in, man.
Yeah, for sure. So what is it being blamed on right now by those that think the hunting should be shut down?
Well, I mean, I think, when the decline here first started, it was the normal kind of thing, coming back to your question of a little bit earlier, how do people react when they see these numbers falling? It's an important species, iconic, it's native to the island, all of those kinds of things. It's a symbol of Newfoundland. You had people who said that it was harsh winters because we had 1 or 2 harsh winters. So they jumped on that. Then you had people who said it was brainworm. We have a European parasite here called Laphostrongylus strangiferi, which is a nematode that can cause brain damage. It's been in our populations for over a century, and periodically it flares up and induces some mortality. But it never caused anything of this scale, of course. But people jumped on that, said, "Oh, it's brainworm, that's causing that." And then it just so happened that in the 1980s, the little wolf, the coyote, adventuresome little beast that he is, following the trend northward of the warming trends and the changes in ecosystems, he managed to find his way to the island of Newfoundland by coming across on the sea ice, feeding on seals. A beautiful story, amazing. This little Southwest adapted dog, desert dog from the United States of America.
It's a coyote.
Yeah. It comes all the way. They come all the way up. They spread, of course, as they have been doing for decades now, And finally, they see this big, they step off the sea ice off the mainland of Canada onto the sea ice. They see these seals out there pupping, and the afterbirths and all this kind of stuff. So they're attracted out there, and then finally they see looming, this Edenic place out there in the distance, shimmering beyond the ice, which is the island of Newfoundland, which has no wolves, so they don't have to worry about wolves. And they came ashore. So then, of course, people would find images of caribou being fed on by coyotes, and then the story was, oh, the coyotes have done it all, right? But we convinced the government here to put $20 million down on the table and allow us to put together a team of wildlife researchers and professionals. We had 14 PhDs and master students involved. We ran it for 8 years. We compiled every scrap of information, including this historical data, and we demonstrated beyond any reasonable doubt that this was a food density dependent response. And today, finally, a lot of people now accept the fact that this big decline was caused by habitat, largely food, and that we simply are going to have to wait. There's nothing we can do about this. We have to wait until those populations recover and try to assist them as we can. And of course, one of the differences between caribou and white-tailed deer and moose, etc., is caribou have one calf only. That's it. So their rate of increase is much slower than these.
Okay. So the working theory is sort of what you said earlier, was they kind of got a little bit over their skis population-wise. The habitat took a negative impact because of that. It takes a long time for the habitat to recover. Meanwhile, they're declining, and it's just this long cycle kind of roller coaster ride that they go through.
Yeah, I mean, between 1915 and approximately 55, there was no caribou hunting on the island of Newfoundland. It was illegal because they were so low. The hunting only really started, late 50s, early 60s. But of course, most people, that's all they can remember. So they think we always had caribou.
Gotcha.
But we didn't. We couldn't.
And how many caribou, legally get harvested a year hunting up there?
When we had, the populations were up at about 100,000 animals, we were taking up to 10, maybe 12,000 animals a year. And we could do that some years. It depended, again, in what phase of growth they were in. My personal view, and I tried to convince people of this, but I was unsuccessful. My personal view is the experiment should be run to cut those increasing populations when they're at approximately half their peak. So we know they'll get up, let's say, to 100,000. When they get to 50, we should be harvesting them to keep them there. And to see whether that would, elongate these cycles, allow us to have more caribou for longer periods of time. Yeah. But, that's a pretty sophisticated experiment to bring in, and you need commitment for 20, 25, 30 years. And
I talk about that. That's funny. That's maybe an interesting analogy with the businesses I work with, including my own businesses. And this is just my personal opinion. Probably a lot of people would disagree with me. But I would rather have a business that doesn't have extreme highs and extreme lows, but always is growing than, and so like cutting out the highs and the lows with just kind of a straight line that constantly always points up and to the right is much more comfortable for me in running my businesses. So I see what you're saying there. That makes sense to me. Is it at real risk right now of being banned? Like, is it very close?
Yeah, I think you could see over the last number of years just here, hunting has been stopped in a lot of places. This big George River population I mentioned to you that came from 750 to 12, that there's no longer any hunting of that population, for example. And there's been lots of other areas closed across Canada. And even moving into Alaska, you have herds, some of the herds are doing okay, but you also have herds there that have fallen. On the island of Newfoundland, we still have a small amount of hunting, a few hundreds of licenses. Whether they will all be taken remains to be seen. I think there's a reasonable probability that there will be a period, again, of no hunting of woodland caribou on the island, particularly if they continue to fall. And that's a little bit more understandable because as people see the population still declining, getting lower and lower and lower, they of course do worry about additive
Right.
mortality and
Right.
whether the hunting is in fact additive. There were calls to stop the hunting when I was working the populations, and that's almost 8-9 years ago now.
Mm-hmm.
And I argued against that at the time because I felt that the populations could still maintain a much reduced harvest, and it's very hard to pick those traditions up again in today's world. Let's say in the 20th century, between 1905, 1910 up till the 1950s, we did not have hunting. So let's say 45 to 50 years. Well, the culture and the society had not changed so much in Newfoundland, actually, between 1900 and 1950. And so a return to that lifestyle was very easy to imagine. If we were to close caribou hunting on the island of Newfoundland today for 50 years, it is not automatic that we would then return to that activity 50 years from now.
Yeah, it's very difficult to get that stuff back.
It is. And so I've always been very reluctant. I've been very willing to see harvest rates decline. But I've been very reluctant to end them because of that fact. And of course, once you end the hunting of some of those species, you lose one of the most outspoken groups in support, wondering about, are they doing well? Why isn't government doing more? A lot of that kind of political agitation comes from the utilitarian group, the hunting group. And coming back to this point about, we should have hunted the populations harder. This is a general principle. A lot of people in the hunting world are always concerned, that there's too many licenses being given. But the phenomenon I point out about caribou, which takes place over 60 to 90 years of rising and falling in response to habitat, that happens with most species. And for example, with moose populations on this island, I have long advocated that we should be harvesting them much, much harder to keep them in that sweet spot between their population numbers and the habitat available. Because with moose, if you keep them there, females will twin, they'll often produce triplets, and that means that you can harvest quite a number of animals each year from a moose population if the habitat is there for good reproduction and still have a very healthy population. But often it's hunters themselves who slam the agencies and say, too many licenses, when what they ought to be concerned about in many cases are too few licenses being issued for these populations.
Hunters are very, and I because I'm part of that group and I have sympathy for them. I understand where this comes from, but I think they're oftentimes selfish in their opinions on stuff like this, not maliciously, but it just comes from the sub. Hunting is a very this, but for those that are listening that don't, hunting is at its nature very competitive, and when you, for example, when you finally find a spot that, if you're an elk hunter and you finally find this spot on public land that has a lot of elk in it, and you've been hunting it for a few years, you don't want to share it. You don't want more licenses sold. You don't want anybody coming from it. You don't want to park at your parking spot and see a license plate from California or wherever. It's not you're not in a sharing mood. You worked your ass off to find that, and then if you add on top of that how there's heavy competitiveness, whether it's good or bad, can be debated around trophy hunting. Maybe it's an area that has only a certain number of big animals, for lack of better terms. These guys and gals don't want to share this information. They don't want more licenses, and it is. I find myself whining about this, Shane. The last few years, it has become extremely difficult to draw tags. It is getting exponentially harder every year. People always talk about access. And I think a lot of times they're talking about in context to actually placing your feet on a piece of ground that you can hunt legally. But I see the bigger problem, access to tags, like access to actually being able to legally go hunt somewhere. For example, Montana, which was my home state for 8 years. Yeah. I moved away 4 years ago. This is the second year in a row I haven't been able to get an elk tag that even just 5 years ago you could get 100% chance every year if you spent the money. Yeah. I think I guess what I'm saying is, and maybe you can agree or disagree with me, is that there is that mentality in hunting where it's like a mentality of scarcity as opposed to like this communal or sharing or whatever you want to call it mentality that we do run into. And it's for good reason sometimes. But to your point, there are situations where, you know, we got to get past our our selfishness and look at the bigger picture, right?
Well, you have to remember too, again, there are cultural differences. If you were to talk about hunting in the Nordic countries, for example, in Finland or Sweden, then of course, Norway, it's quite a bit different because very often there are sort of allotments of hunting, and it's not truly communal, but there's more of that kind of communal engagement as to who hunts and who does not. And you have to remember that American society is I've watched American society very closely. I'm fascinated by America, the United States of America, I'm referring to here. And I've spent a lot of time in the country, of course, over the last 30 years speaking. I've been everywhere. Well, everywhere. I've been in every state certainly, and I've met a lot of different cultures in the United States, which there are. There are really different cultures. There are Western cultures, and there's Southern cultures, and there's Southeastern cultures, and there's Northwestern cultures and Northeastern cultures. I mean, there really are, which is one of the great things I like about the United States, the fact that there are those cultures. The music is different, and the outlooks are different, and the politics are different, and so on and so forth. Frankly, there's lots of different opinions on all these things, but I like the fact that diversity is there. But one of the things that Americans share, of course, everyone knows this, Americans are competitive people. That is part of what has driven the country to have the status in the world it does, economically, militarily, from a point of view of influence and so on and so forth. And so there's a little bit of that's tied up, and to some extent Canadians have that, but they don't have it on steroids like Americans do, but they have it. But as I said, if you go to other parts of the world, it can be quite different. And so I think there is a real competitiveness about hunting for that reason. There's a competitiveness about hunting anyway because of what you have to invest to be successful. And you have to remember that at the end of the day, as I said to a group of people not terribly long ago, if you don't understand hunting at all, and you've never done it, and you're trying to figure out why anyone would do it, simplest thing for you to understand, and most hunters don't get this, is that in the end, hunting is about possession. Hunting is ultimately about possessing that thing. And that transfers itself to many things. As a tiny boy catching bees in a jar, it was about possession. Instead of those things flying around, I wanted to see them there. Catching sticklebacks and eels in the little rivers where we were, I didn't want them swimming in there. I wanted to see them in my jar. I wanted to possess them and have them. And that's a form of hunting, what I was doing as a little boy. I was capturing these living things. I wasn't eating them, of course. I was eventually letting them go. But still, it was that part of that transition to doing this kind of thing. And so when you realize that ultimately, despite the fact that we enjoy the experience, we love it in the outdoors, there's the physicality of the hunting, there's the camaraderie of the hunting, deep down, most hunters want to, in the end, possess that elk. They want that elk in their hands. They want that animal.
What is that? Why is that?
Well, I think this is at the heart of some of the real complexity around hunting, which is never discussed. Social scientists and those who do surveys in the public mind ask these categorical questions, why do you hunt? And, what are the benefits and so on and so forth. But, deep down, what is moving us in this direction of still hunting, and there's many forms of hunting. As I've said, all world fisheries are hunts.
Right.
People don't think about that. That's what they are. We pursue a sentient creature. We capture them. We kill them. We butcher them. We eat them. Mm-hmm. It's a hunt. In the ultimate part of the human, once we became meat eaters, our entire focus and relationship with the others, the rest of the animal world, was fundamentally changed. We became driven to possess the kudu or driven to possess the bison, or driven to possess whatever the animal might have been, because our very lives depended on this, number one. And that's extraordinarily practical reason for possessing. The animal was no good to you simply to look at. Its robe did not keep you warm by looking at it under that shaggy beast out there on the plains.
Mm-hmm.
And its meat did not fuel your belly and allow you to reproduce and have children, and for your mate or your wife to be able to feed that child, But you were fascinated. Possessing it was absolutely essential. But there is a psychological part of this that has nothing to do with consumption. There is this idea of seeing that magnificent thing that you cannot touch. You cannot simply run up to it and touch it like you can your Labrador Retriever or your Springer Spaniel or your whatever. You cannot do that, but you want to. If you think about how many times you want to actually make physical contact with an animal that lives in your home, like a cat or a dog, think about that. You can have an animal for 12, 15, 20 years. And almost every single time that animal comes near or you walk past, what do? You touch, you possess, you want to have the touch of that. The wild thing is even more. It has more mystique. It has more allure. It has more seduction. And you look at that thing and you want to be able to hold it. And for biologists who anesthetize animals, dart them to put collars on and so on, it's a very interesting experience because you're halfway in that world. You immobilize them and finally you can walk up to a 1,200-pound moose and you can actually touch it. You can put your arms, which is what it takes, around its neck. You can smell its fur. You can look right into its eye. That is an extraordinarily powerful thing for any animal to be able to do. And for this animal, the human animal, that is also incredibly important. All hunting is about possession.
How is that justified?
Well, I think I don't know if I would use the word justified. I would say that I would use the word, why is it necessary?
Why is it necessary?
I would say why it is necessary is because we cannot escape our ecology any more than the great whales can. There is no point in asking the great whales or wishing that they should suddenly become fruit feeders in our pastures or our orchards. The human ecology is an ecology that was, and we know this, that goes back to millions of years before our modern form, where we did extraordinary things to compensate for our lack of predatory capacity, but to achieve meat-eating status. We developed tools, and we know that the stone tool cultures go back millions of years. In our present form, we're only a very recent species, 100,000 years or so. But the precursors of this are very, very old. We have an ecology that had us harvesting other wild animals, just like the jackal did, or the hyena, or the lion, or the leopard, or the bear, or the wolf, or whatever it might be. And so to live in the context of our culture, our ecology, as it was developed, this is something that we strive to do and is buried deep within essentially the DNA of our species. Now, some would argue that we've reached a point where we don't not need to do that. But if you look at it, across the world today, the consumption of meat is continuing to rise. There's a few things being played out with, burgers that look like made of vegetable matter and so on. But the truth of the matter is that the consumption of meat is rising globally. And everywhere that GDP rises, pretty much meat eating continues. In other words, we are not abandoning our culture by not doing something like hunting ourselves. We're just using a proxy. We're taking those domesticated animals and we're acquiring and possessing the same thing we wanted to possess before, which is meat. Now, people will say that, that's not justified anymore, and that is not correct because, somehow we've had enlightenment since the Industrial Revolution. We know we can produce foods otherwise. We can become vegetarian. We can choose these other ways of making a living. Well, the truth of the matter is that we always had significant amounts of vegetarianism in our diets. It's not like we, only ate meat, although there were some cultures, like the Inuit cultures, for example, that could not grow vegetables and so on, who lived almost exclusively on a meat diet. But we always had this admixture of meat, roots, tubers, berries, nuts, fruit, and so on and so forth. But let's make no mistake about it. To simply decide that we will cut out any harvest and consumption of meat is not to be, in some sense, consistent with our humanness. It's actually to move away from our humanness. That is what's happening. And the other side of that equation is, I think it's wonderful that people will choose to become vegetarians. I know many in my circle of friends and acquaintances. And those who are knowledgeable about that lifestyle are obviously able to keep themselves extremely healthy by adopting that way of eating. But let us not fool ourselves about what that does to the planet. It is not as though the production of vegetable matter, whether it is grains or fruits or vegetables or whatever it might be, it is not as though that happens, particularly on the scale that's required today, without having impacts on the planet, for biodiversity, for wildlife in general, for natural systems, for the use of pesticides and industrialized products of all kinds. And so if the desire to move away from a meat-eating lifestyle is to suggest that humanity can exist in almost a non-intrusive, non-use fashion on the planet, I just think that's just absolutely untrue.
It's definitely putting your head in the sand, you know.
It is. And but on the other hand, I think the efforts we make with regard to much of land-based wildlife now can only lead us in a direction where we have to admit that if everyone in the world wanted to hunt wildlife today, that would not be sustainable either. We have reached a point where change has to take place. And this is where the great phenomenon of domestic livestock comes in. But again, domestic livestock, necessary to us, absolutely. But does it come without a cost to the planet? Absolutely not.
Is there anything that comes without a cost to the planet?
If you are an animal, and we are nothing but animals, you know my feelings on this, David, very well. I have never believed in any difference between us and any other species since I was a boy, and I certainly don't believe it now. We are simply an animal, and every animal, whether it's an aardvark or a shark or a small perching bird, or it doesn't matter what it is. All animals require food, and they require space. They require oxygen. They require water. They often require shelter. There is a cost to the planet for every single one of us. But we also give back. We give back in terms of carbon dioxide. We give back in terms of defecation. We give back in terms of our own bodies, essentially returning to the soil and rejuvenating the soil, returning what this is, the carbon and other sources of the good stuff that's buried in this body eventually gets returned to the soil, whether we cremate or don't cremate, doesn't make any difference. The challenge for human beings, of course, is to understand that we have an ecology, but we also have the capacity, as a result of spending millions of years perfecting technologies, millions of years. There's a straight line from those stone tools to the largest factory freezer trawler. Just took a long time to get there, that's all. But it's just a straight line of experimentation, adaptation, and response to our, better and better capacities for taking things. We have to realize that, we are now in a position to drastically affect natural systems. The challenge is not to deny our natural ecology. The challenge is to put limits on the excesses that we've developed through technology and other products. And I don't think we have to deny our basic ecology, and nor do I think we have to diminish unnecessarily the harvest from the wild. I think the people who harvest wild things to eat, whether it's wild fishes, which feed 2 billion people in the world and employ 600 million, whether it's the people who hunt for some of their own protein, of which there are millions and millions and millions and millions of people, tens and hundreds of millions, if you include indigenous peoples all around the world who still do that today. The people who gather wild berries and wild fruits, how many people does that include? Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions. People who gather wild mushrooms, all of those people who are doing those kinds of things, that should be encouraged. And that can never feed us all, but we should be doing a far better job of maximizing that offtake. When we look at a piece of land anywhere in the world today, any piece of land that we look at, whether it's in Montana or Oregon or Newfoundland or England or France or Spain or Southeast Asia or Central Asia or Africa, I don't care where it is. The very first thing human beings should ask when they look at a piece of land is, does that have food production capacity? As it exists there now. And if it does have food production capacity, the second question should be, are we able to increase that natural food production? We can grow wildlife, Dave. We know enough about wildlife that we can grow wildlife if we wanted to do. We can grow snowshoe hare. We can grow moose. By grow, I mean naturally grow. Improve habitats and have them explode. Mm-hmm. We ought to be looking at, while we need domestic livestock, while lots of people will want to be vegetarian, et cetera, we also need to be paying much more attention to these wild resources and these wild places on public and private land where we can increase the food production for everyone to be able to harvest these species. And I will argue till the day I die that a wild animal that has lived its life in freedom and fullness, that eventually is harvested to feed a family and friends, that's part of the food economy of whether an indigenous or a non-indigenous person, I believe that animal has lived a better life. And from an animal welfare point of view, has lived a much fuller existence than the domestic animals in many cases that we raise, because we simply can't let them roam free.
Right.
You can't have a gazillion hogs roaming free. You can't have 10 gazillion chickens roaming free.
Right. It's not
scalable. Fortunately, with cattle, we have some capacity to allow them to free range and sheep, but for many species we can't. And so I think we need a transformation on this issue of our ecology. Is it defensible? Should we still be doing it? And my answer to that is we already know, everyone knows, and finally the medical systems are starting to understand. We are healthier in nature. We are healthier living off nature. So why the hell don't we get at this business of looking at nature primarily as a food and water, obviously, those other things that we need, provisioning systems. And instead of looking at the next place to build a ski resort or the next place to build a strip mall, why don't we rate every single piece of land in terms of its food production value and then ask the experts, the food ecologists, the agronomists, the agriculturalists, the food scientists, the biologists, and so on and so forth, how much more food can you have that produce for human beings that's sustainable, fully natural, and provided to us by those natural systems?
It seems like, first there was this field to table movement in recent years where it became more popular to know where your food came from, right? It started gaining popularity. And I'm 41. It could have happened a long time ago too, but to me, this is pretty recent in terms of mainstream, right? My family's always lived this way, but mainstream culture, field to table became really popular. And now there's, it seems like it keeps getting more popular in terms of living closer to nature. When the pandemic hit, anecdotally, I also spend some of my time in the real estate industry. And when the pandemic hit, and I focus mostly on land and rural, in the rural areas of Oregon, when the pandemic hit, everybody was trying to get out of the city and back to nature, right? Obviously there was obvious reasons for that, meaning they didn't want to, be locked into their apartment in Portland for 3 months and can't go outside. But I think also there was this realization, it's like, holy crap, life is super fragile. Now is the time to have that sustainable farm that we've always wanted, honey. Now is the time to be closer and screw all of this craziness, screw all this grinding. Like, we need to get closer to nature. That's what it seemed like to me. So when you add that on top to the field to the table movement that was already happening, and now even this whole carnivore diet movement that's happening right now, that's really popular. And I'm no dietitian or doctor, but I do follow a lot of people that are very healthy that have been doing it for years at this point. So my point is like, to you, does it seem like there's positive momentum in that direction that you're speaking of?
Yeah, I do. I really feel there is. I mean, one of the things that people have to understand in the medical profession and in the dietitians world, etc., is the human beings, that painted the caves in France and Spain beginning 35,000 years ago and up until about 12,000 years ago. They were absolutely no different genetically than David Brinker is. They were you and you were them.
They were probably in better shape than me.
They might have been in better shape, but they were better artists, maybe.
Yeah, they for sure were better artists.
But so the point is that your body, your physiology, your capacity for digestion, the way you uptake micronutrients, the way they are processed in your body, the way you fight disease, the way you repair injury, all of those kinds of things are exactly the same. There hasn't been 1 ounce of real change in all of that.
And we forget that. That's a really interesting point, because it takes a really, really, really long time for any dramatic amount of change to happen, right? From an evolutionary perspective. Yeah. I'm no scientist, but I would assume 50,000 years ago, in terms of the time of our world, is next to nothing.
No, I mean, modern humans came out of Africa. We're all African, ultimately.
Right.
70,000 years ago, we all came out of Africa. Or we didn't all come out of Africa, but,
right.
People came out of Africa.
Right.
And those people were, as I said, essentially who we are. All the changes that we have seen in that length of time, they have not been morphological. We don't have human beings with 3 arms. We don't have human beings with 4 eyes. We don't have human beings with 8 ears. We don't have human beings that can run at 100 miles an hour. We don't have some human beings who are able to fly. We don't have webbed fingers. I mean, we are what we were, and we were what we are. And so naturally, it's like, you have an animal comes into your home. Let's say you acquire a pony, or you acquire a horse, or you acquire a dog, and you talk to the experts in that world, the veterinarians, the animal doctors, and they will give you advice. Well, this is what, you don't feed your horse Jello, and you don't feed your dog grain, or wheat. I mean, there's a recognition that the morphology and adaptations of the animal require a certain kind of diet, a certain kind of lifestyle. Well, therefore, it is no surprise to anyone like me that so many people, no matter what their engagement with nature is, no matter how mild and delicate it might be, just, a small little walk on a cleared path, and they sit on a rock and watch the brook run by, or whether it's something much more intense where somebody, hunts an elk at high elevation, or, whatever. It doesn't matter what the level of intensity of engagement in nature is. Everyone comes out of that experience feeling what? Well, they might describe it in different ways. They may say, I feel more peaceful, I feel better, or I feel happier, or I feel whatever. This is all true. This is not made up in their minds. These are not all crazy people who go out and come back in that experience and report on it. These can be young men. They can be young women. They can be children. They can be old people. They can be very old people. They can be people of every kind of race, religion, and descent, and they will all express exactly the same reaction. It's the same with food. People who eat foods that our bodies are designed to consume, which generally speaking have been fairly high fiber, high protein with relatively low fat, because wild animals contain, as we know, relatively small amounts of cholesterol and stored fat and so on. Those diets with small amounts of sugar and small amounts of salt, because we couldn't get them in large amounts. Sugar and salt we couldn't get in large amounts. That's why we can't get enough of them now once we get a taste for them.
Oh.
that was the diet that, made us what we are. And so suddenly, when you eat those foods, yes, you absolutely feel better. And when somebody has my lifestyle, when, in my freezers down here, there's caribou and there's moose and there's partridge and so on and so forth. When I cannot have that food, and I travel, as you know, I travel a lot, and I'm going to hotels, and I'm on aircraft, and I'm in those restaurants and airports, and so on and so forth. And after a week of that, I feel like, like somebody just should put a big plunger in my ear and
Oh,
haul everything out of my body.
I dread it. I dread it.
And that's not made up. You don't feel well. You feel bloated, and you feel waxy, and you feel less strong, and you feel everything. So I really believe that the people who are beginning to return to this lifestyle, and it's funny because one time, we lived the lifestyle all the time, but now society has changed. And people have to sort of make a conscious effort a lot of times to go to that lifestyle. I didn't have to make any effort. I grew up in that lifestyle. Right. That's what you ate. And that was it. Now people have to make a choice to go to that lifestyle. And lots of people are doing it, and to different extents and lots of different ways. The challenge is, how do we produce enough of that kind of wild food to really make a difference? Now, I started this Wild Harvest Initiative a number of years ago, which has become a very big program where we're assessing just how much wild food and wild meat do we actually consume on this continent. And that's giving us a baseline to know where to work from. But I can guarantee you that there are many places in the United States of America and in Canada to this day, equipped with the knowledge that we have about how habitats and wildlife populations work. There are many places that if we put our minds to it, we could grow an enormously enlarged amount of wild food, whether that is wild mushrooms, whether that is wild fish or wild mammals or wild birds, etc. And the people who are turning to this lifestyle also will recognize one other really important distinction between the lifestyle that is based on the wild forage and the lifestyle that is based on the forage that's delivered by Skip the Dishes. And one of those most important differences is this. Whether you harvest wild berries or wild mushrooms or a wild elk or wild trout, you are inclined immediately upon possessing that to give it away, to share it. As soon as the moose is down, we are talking about Uncle Jack would like a roast, and grandmother would like this, and so would like that. And we get home and we have our animal butchered, we cut it up, and we start laying it aside. And then the next day or the next week, we bring that piece of meat to a friend or a neighbor or a family member. The same way when we bring fresh berries home and give it to our grandparents or a grandmother, and she bakes a pie. That's not the same pie that she makes by going and buying apples at the store. That's a different pie. That's an elevated pie. That's a really important pie. And that pie has to be shared in some kind of special way at some special family gathering. It has to be given back then to the grandchildren. This is also an important signal as to this continuity between our past as ancient foragers, where, of course, all food was shared amongst the community and amongst the tribe. This is an incredibly resilient behavioral manifestation of what wild foraging does to people. It turns this generosity outward, and it does so in a modern society where it might otherwise be thought odd. Because if you went to the grocery store and bought a roast of beef and brought it over to your brother or your uncle or your mother-in-laws or whatever it might be, they would all think you had lost it. If you went and suddenly said, I'm going to buy you, a chicken, and walked up to them and said, here, I bought you a chicken at the grocery store, they would similarly think you're crazy. But if you brought them a brace of ducks, or if you brought them a roast of elk, or if you brought them wild mushrooms gathered somewhere, not only would they not think you crazy, they would think you're absolutely wonderful.
Right.
Now, we ought to ask ourselves, if we have all this evidence, why are we not trying to do more meaningful things in society to increase this opportunity, particularly when we have these, field to table, these movements that are out there, the Neanderthal diet, all of these kinds of things. Why aren't we trying to feed that more? Instead of society trying to keep people out of that space, out of harvesting wild creatures, out of sharing all that wild meat, out of living healthy in that way, society should encourage that. And for the people who cannot kill animals themselves, which I totally, absolutely understand and respect, for those who cannot do that, they should not necessarily look at that to mean everyone should not do so. And they should find someone who will share that wild food with them, because it's a natural thing for these wild harvesters to do. I have great faith in these wild harvesting tendencies that are showing up in people, but I understand it perfectly. It's this echo of who we were.
Not very long ago.
Not very long ago. Absolutely. Not very long ago.
I wanted to ask you, sometimes well, if you look around, like, I have a brother who lives in Los Angeles. So I'll go down there and visit periodically, which you talked about cultures within the United States, like subcultures. So like the culture where I come from is totally different than the culture where he comes from, obviously. So when I go down there, I do a lot of people watching. I do a lot of observing. I do a lot of like just kind of thinking, because it's so much different than where I live. One of the things I notice is people's unconscious magnetic drive towards natural things. Like they want the real hardwood floors. They want that really cool plant. They love their park and their neighborhood, and they love all these things, but they never actually think about why they love that and why they need that. Which is the fact that used to be home, and it makes you feel like you're close to your home, and like we have this. That's who you are. But you don't really realize it when you're in that environment. You like go to the park to play with kids. The kids go there. They play with their friends. It's like, well, yeah, but you're also going to the park because that's actually feels a lot more like home than your mansion. Like that's the sunlight and the smelling of the whatever, and all those things. And I don't know. I think about that. It's like natural, organic things are becoming much more popular, and I just don't oftentimes think people consciously realize why that is. It's like, well, that's because we're kind of circling back to where we were, Well,
of course, and there's many manifestations of it. People, your listeners should just reflect, on a list like this. I mean, ask yourself why it is generally true. I mean, there are some nouveau architectural designs, but generally true, predominantly true. We sleep upstairs in our houses. Now, why should that be the case? That is the case because it comes from a much, much older kind of pattern in our primate lineage, where, of course, we in the nighttime, we retreated to tree nests and we stayed up high. Up high was the safest place, away from snakes and insects and particularly predatory things that crawled along the ground, things that hunted us. There is a pattern in our behavior, about how we build houses and where we sleep, that has nothing to do with the realities of today. Nothing. It is totally. I mean, why shouldn't the kitchen be upstairs and the bedrooms all downstairs, et cetera, et cetera? Mm-hmm. But generally speaking, that's not the case. Mm-hmm. Everybody who buys a piece of land, doesn't matter where it is and how small the suburb or how small the piece of land, they recreate the Serengeti. They open up an area which has a broad grass plain, and then they plant small shrubs and some trees, at distances from one another, so you can move between them and so on and so forth. Not too many trees, mostly an expanse of grass. This is the ancient homeland. This is the ancient image of the landscapes that we can remember, which is why a lot of people, when they revisit parts of Africa, say, my God, I feel like I've always been here. We recreate the Serengeti everywhere we go.
Wow, that's really interesting.
Why do we have barbecues? Or let's take fireplaces, for example. This is a good one. How is it that I can go into a family's home in Alabama, or Texas, where at times of the year, as a northern human, I can barely breathe. The heat just destroys me.
Right.
But there's these beautiful fireplaces that are often used. They're not just for show, they're used. Why? Because these fires, these central fires, are hearkening back to that is where we gathered around, isn't it? Now we might have a bourbon in our hands and
Right.
smoke a pipe or something, but
Right.
this is where we gather for that end of the day kind of relaxation. Barbecues. You have a barbecue in your backyard, which is your portable fire pit, of course, and you get out there and you put your burgers on or your corn or whatever you're going to eat. You have it there and you have friends over. And what do all the friends do? The friends come over around the barbecue and they look at the barbecue.
They stand there and they stare at it. Yeah.
They stare at it while you're
Yeah.
turning over the stuff.
Yeah.
But you could have 200 turkeys being cooked in your oven, in your kitchen, and not one of them would ever go in there and look inside that oven to look at those birds. But they will do that. Phobias. All of our phobias are ancient. We're afraid of spiders. We're afraid of snakes. We're afraid of heights. We're afraid of big storms. Why don't we have a car phobia? Why don't we have a rifle phobia? Why don't we have, way more people die as a result of these kinds of things. But all of this is ancient. So why should we not understand that if these things can be so much a part of our lives, candlelight is another one. Why should the candle industry be a multi-billion
It's such
dollar
a simple
industry
thing. Yeah.
when you can flip a switch anywhere, in your studio, in your home, under your counters, wherever you want to be, you can have any kind of light that you want? Why is it that people, women in particular, love warm baths, and they love to take warm baths, long warm baths, and they love to have candles there? This is an ancient thing. Nobody ever wrote the lineage of humans that are called female and wrote a code that said, and you will like hot baths, even if it's centuries and millennia from now, you will like to have that kind of experience.
Right.
Why is it that children, babies, as soon as you put them on the ground, what is the first thing they do? They grab soil and grass and they put it in their mouths. And you ask any epidemiologist today, and they will tell you that is an absolutely crucial thing for a child to do, because they are beginning to build their resistance from that very point in time. Even little babies that you cannot explain something to do something incredibly natural.
The other thing that I think about, Shane, all those are mind-blowing points. I think we miss it. I think deep down we miss the things that we don't even know we miss. Like when you look at the stars, when you're outside and you look at the stars, and it on the right night it sends chills down your body, right? Why? I'm just looking at a sky full of shiny things that I have no idea what they are, but there's this feeling, there's like this connection to the past that if you really, I don't know, like my favorite is going out in the desert, like the out in the middle of the desert, there's no light pollution whatsoever, and just staring at the stars. Why do I like doing that? I don't know. Maybe we used to do that a lot. Maybe we used to, I don't know, but there's something about that.
We know we did that a lot, and that's why we have places like Newgrange and Stonehenge and these famous archaeological sites where the solstices, for example, are perfectly captured in certain chambers at the light at just that time of year. These are phenomenally precise, buildings. I've been to them, and to build those massive stone structures with no machinery and build them in such a way that, at the perfect hour, light will penetrate and illuminate a chamber buried deep within those stone walls. It's just extraordinary. So we did spend a lot of time, David, looking at that. And we do miss the past. Of course we miss the past. And this is all part of what really matters to us. We remember in a real sense by virtue of the reaction that our bodies and minds have to those experiences. it's not a memory in the same sense that, oh, I can remember when, I was part of the Plains Indians who chased the buffalo on horseback.
Mm-hmm.
But I do know that I can, in thinking about that, have this sense of exhilaration, this sense of and admiration. That's the other thing. The admiration we have for people who were capable of delivering from the outdoors. The only reason professional athletes make the money they make, and believe me, 10 years from now they'll make more, and 20 years from now they'll make more again. There is no limit to how much money we will pay professional athletes. Why? The reason is those individuals gifted with speed or strength or hand-eye coordination or the ability to watch moving parts of a field and be able to touch objects into the wind and across distances and all of that kind of stuff, to anticipate movement and how quickly one of those animals, one of those players will cover that distance to hit them with the football or the soccer ball or whatever it might be. They were the hunters. They were the superb ones. They were the ones who fed and protected the tribe.
Right.
They are the exceptional ones. And every indigenous culture, every culture that remains with us today, non-technological cultures, if you will, or indigenous cultures that we can still find in the world today or read about from our own indigenous peoples in Canada and the United States, we know that there were people who were better hunters than others. This was well remarked. He was an exceptional hunter.
And they were treasured, just like our athletes are.
They were treasured, just like our athletes. And they did have something special.
Right.
They had better hand-eye coordination.
Right.
Or they had more strength for driving that handheld spear through the mammoth's hide. Or they had better capacity to distract the wild animals while their other their friends and neighbors or compatriots, whatever, were able to take that animal down.
Mm-hmm.
The athleticism that these people had to have, of course, was extraordinary.
Right.
When you had Native Americans riding into those bison herds and sometimes getting caught and would leap off their horses and run over the backs of those moving bison to finally escape the other side. Now, you tell me how many people, trained or untrained in this world today, would be able to do that.
Right.
This is the people. These are the people.
Do you think it's similar? Let's talk about, so artists, right? We pay artists. I constantly play music too. I was at, you'll laugh at this, but just hear me out. I went to a Justin Bieber concert last week. I don't know if you know who that is or not, but he's a very popular pop. Okay.
Yep.
I would have never thought I was going to go to this. I got talked to I was down in Nashville. I got talked into it the same day. And the main reason I wanted to go is because I wanted to see this. It's a Bridgestone Arena in Nashville. It's huge. I don't know how many people it holds. Let's say it's 15 or 20,000 or something like that. It's a lot. I wanted to see it and how this one human, I'm always fascinated by this one human can get this many people together to sing the same songs and with no distractions, basically. And unbelievable, emotions. And it was a surreal experience. I've been to a lot of concerts. Only a few would rival it in terms of energy in the room. But I wonder, when did that start? When did music and art kind of work its way into, the same type of thing as nature is what we've been talking about. We yearn for it. We don't know why, but we're willing to pay. I paid $400 for that concert ticket.
Oh yeah. Well,
why? So I could stand there and listen to someone sing into a microphone, right? But why?
Well, I mean, we know across cultures all over the world that structured, organized, symphonic vocalizations have been part of cultures everywhere. In other words, singing. We know that the people who engage in that singing, while they were communal activities, they weren't very often solo artists. It was everyone in the group, participating. There was always someone, of course, who led that kind of thing, maybe started it or was singled out to start it or whatever. But the idea of music has been with us forever. Drums are ancient instruments. Wing bone flutes, made from various birds from various cultures around the world, go back at least 10, 15,000 years, where people were playing small notes on these things. And of course, the people who were able to do that, and the people in particular who were able to do it well, where did they get their notes? Where did they get their rhythms? Where did they get the intonation? Where did they get the kind of sounds that they were looking for? Nature. They all came from nature. You listen to some of the peoples in Africa still to this day singing. It has this kind of incredible natural rhythmic. It's like wind and soil being blown in the air, or birds flying. I mean, it's just absolutely extraordinary. And of course, all of that, came from nature, mimicking the sounds of birds, mimicking the sounds of mammals. Let us take dance the same way. And so therefore, over time, those who became better at it, of course, like the athlete, they transcended out of this natural, necessary environment into a new dimension. Like the incredible quarterback is no longer throwing the spear to kill the running deer. He is now in a different space, on a different green field, weighing the weight of what he has in his hand and the distance he has to throw it, and looking at all that moving herd out there and picking out one particular animal that he has to throw that spear and connect with, measuring in his mind just like that, distance, time, wind. Tom Brady was the guy who could do that, 50,000 years ago, better than most. So, or maybe better than any, who knows? Let's take dancing. We will discover, and maybe it's already been discovered, but I have not found it yet. But we will definitely discover that there is an influence on female ovulation as a result of dance. The cranes danced. They're the most famous dancers in the animal world, this famous dance that the cranes do. What most people don't realize is that the female crane does not ovulate unless that dance takes place, unless she participates in that dance. Dance has become, and always was, an incredibly sensual thing in human society. We know this going back to very early indigenous societies, coming all the way up through famous societies like the Egyptians, the Romans, the Greeks, et cetera, et cetera. And we also know that dancing has become, in modern society, very much associated with sensual experiences in the nighttime. People go out and, this too, this idea of dance, this is an ancient thing we borrowed from the others. We didn't create that ourselves. We didn't create music ourselves. The music was out there. We brought it into ourselves. And then, of course, we learned how to represent them with the famous sculptures and the famous art. And, anyone who has the opportunity to go to see the parietal art in France and Spain, it is in Altamira and in Lascaux and so on. It is a life-changing experience. The capacities of these people 30,000 to 10,000 years ago, and many of them painted, those caves were painted for 20,000 years running, gives you an idea that, again, humans needed to have a way of communicating with animals, even outside of the hunt or escape, because, of course, we were being preyed on too. And in a way, that art is another example of possessing something. The non-artist, like me, I cannot draw well enough to capture an image I want. But the good artist can almost bring that entity, whether it's a dog or an elephant or a great gorilla or whatever it might be, they can almost give it to you. You can put it on your wall and you almost have it. You possess it virtually by having that image. And so the artists are revered. Of course, they're going to be revered. And the other thing that about artists, of course, is that they were very closely associated with shamanism and this idea that there were special people in society who could reach the other world.
Mm.
They could move through cracks in the rock and see different kinds of visions and come back and report things. And believe me, I've seen films, old black and white films of shamans in various places in Africa going through evening dances of transformation. And it is a completely extraordinary thing to see these individuals leading groups of people in dance, hemorrhaging terribly from their nose, blood running off their bodies from the hemorrhaging that's taking place. All of it induced by some kind of psychosomatic interaction, and all of it designed to give people a deeper view into how the world works. These are real things, Dave. These are not frivolous, silly Hollywood-esque kinds of things. These were absolutely true. And how did we learn that? Was it because just before an animal died, when it was heavily wounded, that we saw something in its eyes that suddenly they could speak to us in a way that otherwise we couldn't speak to them? How did members of the Sioux Nation and others in the United States of America, develop these extraordinarily painful ceremonies of piercing their skin and hanging themselves from poles, as Sitting Bull did, for example, before the Battle of the Little Bighorn? I mean, why did we do these kinds of things? Every single one of those things were given to us by nature. I killed 2 moose 2 years in a row within 50 feet of each other. And when I was butchering my moose the second year, I looked over to the old skull of my moose from the previous year and looked at the place where I had taken the paunch out and the rumen had spilled and so on. And there was this fluorescence of flowers there, which was completely driven by those nutrients that went down there. I'm firmly convinced that it was those kinds of experiences by early hunters that gave them the idea of resurrection. And that's what led us to the idea of internment, of putting our bodies in the soil to see what would emerge from that. I'm totally convinced that that led us to religions where we believed that it was possible for things like transubstantiation to occur. Whereas in the Catholic faith, for example, it's believed that the wafer of bread, the host, actually becomes the body of Christ, and the wine becomes the blood. I don't think any of that was designed by thinkers at the time of the Roman Empire. This is my personal view. I don't want to offend listeners, but I believe this was all brought forward from our deep past and association with nature. Everything we have came essentially from then, including our technology, because it's a great thing to put Voyager on Mars. But it was a pretty god-darned amazing thing, too, for the first people, the first hominids, they weren't human, to look at a stone and believe that if I chip it, and I chip it, and I chip it, I will now have something that makes up for the fact that I do not have claws and talons and big teeth that can shear meat. I can use that to cut through the skin and butcher the meat and break the bones and so on and so forth. That was not a small leap of knowledge.
No. And like you said, there's a straight line from that to Voyager.
Totally.
What's your opinion on the metaverse? What, in terms of, my wife and I talk about this a lot, because obviously we try to live as close to nature as we can. We could do a lot better job, but we respect it. And but when we're looking at our kids, obviously this metaverse is going to be a big part of their future. Odds are some form of it, right? I was just at a friend's house last week where he doesn't have any kids. He has a dog, but at night, and he's a night owl. He sleeps during the day. He's a musician, but he is on his VR headset every night because he doesn't watch TV anymore. He plays poker, virtual poker, in his VR headset for like 4 or 5 hours a night, and he's interacting, and he actually has relationships with these avatars in this world that he actually feels like he knows these people, even though he's never actually seen their flesh. He's seen only their avatar. And I'm trying to juggle it in my mind, like, how do I don't have an opinion right now. I'm trying to figure out, because I know it will be part of my kids' lives. I don't think there's any way to avoid it necessarily. So I'm trying to figure out how to wrap my head around it, knowing that we're already pretty disconnected from where we came from. And we all already spend too much time on screens. And I think it's part of the mental health crisis, et cetera, et cetera. Also physical health crisis because people sit on their asses all day. But like, how, as I guess you and I are pretty aligned from this standpoint of just the importance of nature. How do we wrap our heads around this new thing?
Well, I don't really see it as a completely other world, in the sense that created representations of beings that we could not touch has been part of the experience of humanity for a very, very long time. So we have deep trajectories of religious thought, both from indigenous cultures, which is incredibly varied, but often contains amazing stories of creation, how the world came to be, and who the god or gods are. And we make representations of them and have done for millennia. In organized societies, city-states, once they arose, and major cultures, say the Etruscan, the Roman, the Greek, etc., a massive amount of effort was developed into creating the first avatars, which essentially are statues. I mean, we created these pantheons. You'd walk through churches, there'd be statues everywhere. And did people think that was just a statue? No, they believed that was the Virgin Mary, or they believed that was so-and-so in our standard religions, but in previous societies, they believed that represented the Greek gods, or believed that it represented the Roman gods, or whatever it might be. And for the people who believed and the people who looked to them, they weren't just this physical structure. They weren't just that statue, for example, or this symbol, or whatever it might be. They believed it had life, and it had force, and you could relate to it. And if you prayed to it, if you embraced it, if you honored it, for example, that good things would happen to you, because somehow that entity was able to speak to the powers of the universe and deliver to you what you wanted, because you were respectful and honored them. Now, we have carried this forward in such powerful ways over time that many of those structures and ideas became, the underpinnings of conflict and of war. And in fact, very often wars, conquering armies would seek to either destroy or to take away.
Yeah, still happens today.
Still happens to this day, because they believe they had at one point real importance and had spiritual intervention capacity for the universe, within the universe, that could deliver things for human beings. That has become transcended to some extent, where people just give them an economic value today. But that economic value, if you think about it, is based on the fact that previously these historic statues or altars or crucifixes or whatever they might be were actually part of the belief systems of people, and in some cases, of course, still very much are. So the idea that we would take this, in a sense, to another step is really not very surprising to me. It is kind of like taking the stone that was thrown as a weapon. You know, you read about the capacities for particularly Native American women in many cultures to be able to kill birds with just stones that they would throw. They became so accurate at doing this. To go from that to obviously the bow and arrow, which was a completely different entity. Then you come to a weapon such as a pistol or a rifle, and then you go from a rifle where you are basically doing the sighting to suddenly something that has a laser beam on it, and you're really not sighting it at all. You just want to get that little dot out there somewhere, and then you're going to be able to take your target, whatever it might be. And to some extent, I see these things as kind of the inevitable intrusion of technology onto our basic desires, whether that's to hunt effectively or whatever it might be. And so I think this kind of connectivity with beings or entities that are not human, they are gods and goddesses and influencers and trolls and fairies and all these kind of things. This is a very deep thing in the human psyche. And so I think this idea of avatars is something that, is kind of in line with all of that in a way.
It's just an evolution of the same thing.
I think it is. But having said all of that, I do firmly believe that the further we go down these lines, and even as we're doing it, I think we have a sense of this, that the further we go down these lines, the further we are taking ourselves away from some very important things. It's kind of like this debate over in the hunting world, this long distance shooting. And I've always said, well, it's certainly long distance shooting is the right term for it, not long distance hunting, because that's not what's taking place. On the one hand, there are critics, and on the one hand, there are people who are very much in favor. But if you try to look at it overall, it's not for me. But long distance shooting, if your desire is to possess the animal, you can in fact shoot an animal at such a distance where, if you're accurate, you don't wound animals and all those kinds of things. You can in fact kill an animal which will have absolutely no awareness that you're there at all. That's true of shorter range shooting too, but it's a little bit more complicated in those cases. So you can see different kinds of attributes that come out. But one thing for certain, David, is that every time we make one of those technological moves, we lose something really pleasant and really meaningful, because ultimately we are taking ourselves further and further and further away from a natural reality. Even the statue had a physicality to it. You could touch it, you could feel the grooves, you could see where the veils were created, and all that kind of thing. That's not quite true, obviously, with the avatar. This is different. And it reminds me of people, when we developed the internal combustion engine and then eventually created cars and things of that nature. But how much people love to see horses drawing carts,
Yeah, we just saw it in our hometown a couple weeks ago. We were out with the kids, and yeah, there's something about it. I mean, it's literally a horse pulling a cart, but it's like, wow, that's so cool. I'll pay $50 to go sit in it,
Exactly. It's amazing. And you can sit there and you can smell the horse, and you can smell the hay and all that, and you can't go real fast. And so so what do? Well, you enjoy the air and you enjoy the sun, and then you talk about stuff because, so I think in the end, we're all searching for things, a lot of things in life we search for. And we start out with our lives being fairly simple in terms of what really makes us happy. As children, for example, as little humans. it can be, I mean, my two little grandsons, we just gave them a little dog, and I mean, that would be equivalent to giving, I don't know, an adult in the modern world, I don't know, a super yacht or something.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I
Mm-hmm.
mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? It's more valuable than a super
Right.
yacht.
Yeah.
And I think then eventually you acquire things, of course, and eventually you want less things. But along the way, I think this journey is reminding us constantly, like what we've covered on this podcast, the phobias, the sleeping upstairs, recreating the Serengeti, the people looking at the burgers on your barbecue as though it's some miraculous thing you're doing. I mean,
Right.
this is all real,
Yeah.
and I think the more that people are able to engage in nature, um, just the better and happier our societies would be, and the happier people would be. We ought to be on a mission to do two things. As I said before, to recognize that, first of all, first criteria in environmental assessment of any proposed land development ought to be, what is the food production value of that piece of ground? And that should be the embedded principle in all political jurisdictions, public and private. The second thing that we should do is really get serious about turning our cities into much more livable places with accessible natural phenomenon within them. And we have every bit of knowledge and capacity necessary to be able to do it.
Mm-hmm.
There is absolutely no reason in the world why we do not have a better job of that done, except people have not made it a priority.
Right, right. Well, I think the more people connect the dots we've been talking about and actually realize that they do miss it, and there's not really a way around it, and they need it at some capacity in their lives. Some people need it more than others, but we all need it. And I just think the more that we're conscious of that from people like you and others, the better off we all are, and definitely the more happy we'll be. Man, Shane, just for context, I've gotten to 2 bullet points out of like 30 that I wanted to talk to you about. So we're gonna have to do this. We're gonna have to do this again. But man, it's such an honor to have you on. You're so wise. I appreciate you coming on today. And my only criteria is that you come on again, maybe multiple times.
Yeah, I'm happy to do it, David. I'm delighted to see that you're doing this, and we're the talking ape. So let's talk.
Let's stare at a burger on a grill, right?
Exactly.
One last point that my favorite memory of hanging out with you, Shane, was in Victoria, and you gave me the full spiel on how to properly drink a Guinness. Not only properly drink it, but pour it. Why? I mean, I didn't know that it was such a complicated endeavor, but maybe on the next podcast we can talk a little bit about Guinness and your Irish heritage.
I would love to do that, and what we could do on that one, we could probably each have a Guinness at our disposal.
I did think about that. I think next time we'll do that.
All right.
All right.
Let me know.
Okay.
All right, David.
Thanks you, Shane.
Thanks so much. Take care of yourself.